Last year, Escape Motions got in touch with me and said, "Pete, what do you think?" I said, "I think the price of petrols are absolutely ridiculous." And they said, "Oh, okay, but what do you think about Rebelle 5? What could we potentially do to make it better?" So the timing was really good because I'd actually just been thinking about putting together a video on things that I would like to see in Rebelle 6. So instead of doing that video, I put together a few pages of ideas for them. So in this video, what I'm going to do is have a look at what my suggestions were, which ones made it into the final version, and what else they've added that I think is going to be really good going forward. My name's Pete. Welcome to Basement Picasso. Before I share the suggestions, I don't want anybody thinking that I'm trying to claim sole credit for these. It was very nice to be acknowledged in the Rebelle manual that was published, but I think it also helps to show how many people were involved in terms of helping to support the latest version. I would also encourage people to have a look at the Escape Motions website. There's a really active community, and there's a lot of ideas and suggestions that people are helping to feedback to shape the software, to provide ideas and help develop things as we go forward. So I'm quite sure some of my ideas here overlap with other people's thoughts as well. So the suggestions that I put together involved 3 main ideas and 3 extra minor enhancements. So I was suggesting some improvements and enhancements around the brush management, some things we could possibly do with the thickness of the paint, and some ideas around the use and management of stencils. And then I also had a few suggestions around the way that paint can break or run out, the way that you might be able to scrape paint using a palette knife, and potential for being able to import images and colour map them so that you can then work from them or clone them in interesting ways. So those were my 6 suggestions. And out of that, I was really pleased to see that they had been able to bring some things through that support the brush management, which we'll have a look at. And they've also introduced the ability to control the length of the paint stroke that's put down, which helps to give you a different dimension. So we'll have a look at that as well. So when I'm painting, I quite often like to switch between different types of brushes. So I might start off doing some oil paint with various sort of thick brushes, and then want to put maybe a watercolour wash down on top of that. So that always meant you would have to go into a different tool. Then you might have to go into the brushes panels, open out the brushes, and then try and find the brush that you want to work with. Now, it was always really good in the older versions of Rebelle that you could even just do this. It was so easy to swap between different tools and they would just work on a single layer really intuitively. But what's now even better is the fact that you can take these brushes, and if you right click on them, there is now an option to copy that brush preset to favourites. And you can do that with any type of brush from any category. You can just click on it and copy it to the favourites. And what that will do is it will then put those particular brushes into a new category at the end here called favourites. And initially you'll just have a panel that says default, and the brushes that you add will come into that default panel. But what I've done is because I've put quite a lot in, as you can see, I've gone in and I've added groups and then grouped the brushes up. So what I've got is some nice thick brushes that allow me to put down some impasto, things that work with thick paint. I've then got some flat brushes that allow us to work using things like the pastel tools that can put colour down without affecting the underlying texture. And then I've got a number of other brushes from different categories. So I've got things like that watercolour brush that I can just click on. I've also got a fountain pen that's got a sort of watery effect. I've got erasers and blenders that I can just click between, and then very quickly swap between those tools. I can also use this, so one of the hotkeys I have set up on the loop deck is the tab key for tablet mode, and in tablet mode I only have at most 1 or 2 panels visible. So what I can now do is basically just focus on the painting. I've got all my brushes available to me at the side. I can just very quickly swap over to them, and once the painting's a bit more established, I'm typically just picking the colours from the painting anyway, so that painting effectively becomes my palette. So having all the brushes in that one favourites panel is a huge time saver, and it allows you to really just focus on the painting, not having to think about swapping brushes and swapping tools and all those sorts of things. So that for me is an absolute huge benefit in terms of being able to paint quickly and smoothly. So the other part of the suggestion I had for brush favourites would be to allow brushes to be added to a painting individually. So you could maybe have your painting, you could then maybe drag some of these brushes in, and it would form a custom favourites panel or a custom brush panel that you could then add a number of brushes to, and you could then use those brushes on that particular painting. And the idea is that it would then save those brushes with that particular painting, so next time you come back to it and load it, you would have that particular set of brushes ready to go again. So if that's something you think might be helpful, maybe leave a comment below or pop onto the Rebelle forum and maybe add that or your own ideas. That would be really good to hear what people think. The next feature that I suggested that made it in is something that I refer to as breaking, paint breaking. It's the ability to load a brush or a palette knife and then to have that paint run out and then break across the canvas. And I think one of the best implementations I've seen of that is actually on the iPad in the art package called Art Set, which has a particularly good palette knife feel with the way that it pulls paint across and then breaks and mixes. So within Rebelle we've now got something similar. So if you go into the oil tools, for example, the first thing you might need to do is to actually go to the menu and then look at the show sliders, and you'll see that there's a slider there for length. When you click on that, that should start at 100, and that will be set for every brush individually. So that's the way that Rebelle has worked previously. So if you are on the paint mode and then start painting, it's effectively infinite paint. It will just paint as long as you keep moving the brush or the cursor around. As a traditional artist, that's always felt a little unnatural to me, the concept of that sort of infinite paint. So what the length slider allows you to do is, as you reduce that, it then gives you a defined amount of paint that will then effectively run out, and you then have to go and effectively do another stroke or pick another colour and put something else down. So in terms of a sort of traditional feel, that certainly starts to feel more realistic. You can adjust the length slider and that will then give you a longer stroke before the paint runs out. When it runs out, you'll see that it tends to sort of taper out and it picks up a bit of the canvas texture underneath as it runs out. If you put the blend mode onto the paint and mix, then what you'll find is it'll put down the paint, and then when the paint runs out it'll start to mix in, so you get quite a nice ability to put sections of paint down and then blend it back in. So using the length of the paint strokes can work really well if you do something like cloning and tracing to start an image. So for example, if we bring in a reference photo, set that to a new layer, OK that, and then we'll set that to a tracing layer. So in the layers panel, we select that image, put it to tracing, and then I'll actually just hide it for a second, and we'll go back on, and we can then use a brush. And what I've got is the length slider set quite low, and we're just on the paint mode. So now as we start to paint, we'll pick up the colours from the underlying image and just put down nice short strokes for each of those image colours that it's picking up underneath. So you can use that to start to build up a little bit of the image, and if you want to put it on the paint and mix mode, then you can put that down and start to blend in with some of those other colours, and that starts to very quickly give you a nice natural feel and a way to put down initial colours from that underlying image. So the combination of those two work really well. So I think the length sliders are really good and really helpful. The one little enhancement I would possibly like to see as we go forward is a little bit more control as the paint runs out. So at the moment, as we said, it just tapers out with a bit of a kind of grainy effect, and it'd be nice if you had a bit more control and a bit more variety, and that might be something like through the brush creator, being able to have either different shapes or different grains along the length of the stroke, and you would end up with something that maybe looked a bit more like that in terms of running out. I've simulated that with pressure, but if you had the ability to use different grains and different shapes, that would allow you to possibly get some interesting marks. And if you could do 2 or 3 of those across the length of it, you could then really sort of simulate the paint load lessening and then starting to break, and you get different sort of shapes, and it would make it much more natural and realistic to me. So that's what I would like to see. That's a future enhancement. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below, or as I said before, maybe go and let Escape Motions know if you think that or other things are potentially a good idea. So those were 2 of my suggestions that have made it into Rebelle 6, which is really good to see. Obviously they've added a lot more features as part of Rebelle, and the favourite as far as I'm concerned is to do with reference images. So if you add a reference image by dragging it into the reference image panel and then click on it to make it visible, you'll get the reference image appearing, and what you'll see at the top is there's a number of icons, and the one on the right is this thing called Edit Guides. And it's an interesting little feature that has actually fundamentally changed my workflow. So previously what I would have done is started an image by bringing in a reference image, something that I could clone or trace from, and I would start to put down some colours from that. And then once I got to a certain point, I would bring up a new layer and I would do a little bit of very loose tracing just to give me a little bit of an indication of where things were placed, and just put in a very, very rough kind of initial suggestion of things, putting down those lines, just giving me general sort of shapes. And then once I had that tracing done, what I would then be able to do is to drop that layer down and then go back in to the painting and start to build up on that and just kind of refine the shapes and bring in more detail. So starting, the general principles of painting big to small, and then gradually bringing in more details. And the purpose of that kind of three-step process was to allow the initial stage to focus on colour and colour mixing and just get the whole kind of colour sense of the image before I get in any way caught up or too involved in sort of detail and drawing. That's been my sort of standard process for a long time. So what we can now do with the reference images is when you bring up the reference image, we can use these edit guides. When you click on that, you can then draw a guide, and what you'll see is that guide actually appears on the image. So you can put as many of these down as you want. When you put a guide down, you can then move it around, make it bigger or smaller, and you can use that to just basically give yourself some indications of where things are on the photograph or your reference image that you're working from. So if you want to make these lines more visible, you can go into Edit, Preferences, and then on the Colour tab we have Reference Image Guides at the bottom. And if you want to make the lines thicker, for example, then you can set those to a higher value. When you make that OK, you'll see that the lines are now more visible on the diagram. So that then allows you to start painting, and you can use just colours, colour picking, or tracing from your image. But now you're not constrained by these lines. You're simply working generally in the sort of shapes and spaces around them. And what that allows you to do is still just focus a bit more on the colour and the big shapes without getting too caught up in the specific details, the edge quality, that sort of thing. So this, for me, I think is going to make a huge difference to the general sort of workflow. Being able to think about the image as a whole, focus on the colour to begin with, but not get too caught up with the details. So, I know some people start with a very detailed drawing and then they paint, very much within that sort of drawing structure, and that's absolutely fine. Each of their own. There's no right way or wrong way of setting about it. But for me, this being able to start sort of big and loose and bold, and then get sort of colour mixing going as you start to develop things, is really helpful. So that I think is going to be a really, really interesting feature to do more with, and I think a really, really good addition to Rebelle 6. So that's a quick look at a couple of suggestions that I had that have made it in, and also one of the new features that I think is going to be really good going forward. So there was a few other things that I was suggesting, haven't quite made it in yet. It'd be really good to see if there's things that they could maybe do in the future. So for example, one of the things I think is around the texture thickness, and the control you've got over that at the moment in the visual settings is this impasto depth, which you can slide up and down. And what that really does is it makes the texture darker or lighter depending on the value, which does have a little bit of an effect of the texture being thicker, but it's really a sort of pseudo effect. The shadows that are being cast by the texture aren't actually getting bigger. You don't get shadows on shadows, you can't change the angle of the lighting, you can't get really thick gloopy pieces of paint, so it's very limited in terms of feeling just like a millimetre or two of paint at best. So that's one of the things that I think could possibly be enhanced in the future, and it'd be really good to see some options around the lighting and the bump map, and that's actually something I'm going to do a video on in the future in terms of some of the things that are happening in other packages that I think could help to drive these sorts of things forward. The next thing I would quite like to see is things around stencils. So I think stencils are underrated. I did a video on that a while back. I make a lot of use of them. I've got a lot of predefined stencils beyond what comes in the default. All sorts of types in terms of shapes, newspaper, text, all sorts of things. And one of the challenges with these is they're useful to work with sort of one at a time, but the controls are sort of hidden up at the sort of top right of a stencil, so you tend to find that you need to sort of zoom in and out to get to the controls, and in terms of being able to sort of work with them. If you have 2 or 3 stencils on the canvas, and quite often if I'm working on a painting, I want to bring a particular stencil up for a while, work on that, and then remove it, but I still want to come back to it later. And in terms of being able to try and select these different stencils and work with them, it's very difficult to work with more than one stencil at a time. So I think there's things that could be done around stencil control, being able to have multiple stencils and remove them and so on, and be able to work with them in a different way. So my suggestion is possibly having these in the layers, that stencils would appear as a kind of red layer, and then you could do all these kind of controls in terms of making it visible or not, making it active or not, selecting it or deleting it, etc. Would all be done from a much more accessible mechanism, not having to constantly kind of scroll in and out and then try and find things, or not to be able to actually work with it, or have to move things when you don't want to actually move them out the way, to be able to get to other stencils. So for me, potential improvements that could be really helpful to get more benefit out of what you can do with the stencils. In terms of tools, I think there's a couple of things that they could possibly do to help with the sort of realism around things like palette knives. So particularly with tablets that support tilt and rotation, you could potentially do things where your palette knife could either put paint down or potentially lift paint up, depending on the actual angle that you were holding at. So just like a traditional palette knife, you could potentially have it so that when you're pushing forward, it's actually erasing, and then when you tilt it over, that would then put the paint down, and it could lift and sample and then put down a sort of mixed colours. So I think a lot of things are there in terms of the sort of dirty brush and the multicolour and being able to swap between paint and erase, but actually building all that into one tool I think could make a really intuitive palette knife that could make lots of interesting marks. It could erase, it could put paint down, etc. So I think there's some things that could be done with that. Similarly with Airbrush, for me at the moment a lot of the Airbrush feels very digital, so it's effective. I use some of the Airbrush tools in the favourites set that I've got, but again I think there's interesting things. So I have an Airbrush, and you get very different sense in terms of being able to get really fine lines out of it. You can get angled cones. The fact that when you put the brush down, you have to keep moving it to get more paint, whereas an airbrush will just spray paint continuously. And then you've got the kind of the wet effect. So if you keep an airbrush sort of still, you'll start to get build up of water, and then it sprays and spreads out. And again, a lot of that technology is already there in terms of being able to put down water, and then being able to blow it in different directions. That is largely what an airbrush is going to do if you hold it down too long. So being able to kind of build those things together and have the spray, the spatter, and then potentially the water kind of running off. I think there's things there that could be combined and give a really good sort of natural kind of airbrush tool. So things like that I think could be really interesting to potentially add. And then the last thing was around colour mapping. So I think a lot of people use reference images. They'll bring a reference image into their painting, and I think one of the things that could be really helpful with that is instead of working with the natural photo colours, if you were able to colour map it to a particular colour set, then it would basically subtly adjust all the colours. Depends what kind of colour set. You could have a very vivid one, you could have a very limited colour palette, and that would then give you a picture that had a much more limited, harmonious kind of colours as your reference image. And particularly if you're doing something like tracing, that would then potentially be able to give you a kind of more coherent image, and to experiment with different kind of colour sets and different colour themes within a particular reference image. So again, I think that's something that could be interesting for the future. So I hope that was helpful. It's really good to see the new features that have been added in to Rebelle 6. There's certainly a lot of things there that I'll be able to make really good use of going forward. Very interested to hear what you think. Are there things there that you'll be able to use? Are there things that you'd still like to see added? Do let me know either in the comments below, or as we said before, feel free to get involved with the community and help move the software forward. So for just now, thank you very much for listening, and hopefully we'll catch up with you soon.